There is a plant that seems to break every rule modern agriculture set for itself. Towering sunflower stalks toss their heads in summer light, while hidden beneath, knobbly tubers accumulate like a secret pantry, starch-rich, perennial, and oddly persistent. Plant once, harvest many seasons. Let it go, and it returns. Plant once, harvest forever. It sounds like a gardener's fairy tale. It is not. Imagine a field of tall stems, yellow faces following the sun, and at the roots a network of irregular potato-like bulbs, each one a small festival of starch and flavor. The plant is Helianthus tuberosus, most often called by names like sunchoke, Jerusalem artichoke, or sunroot. For centuries it lived at the margins of empires and the center of tables, tended by people who understood how landscapes could be coaxed into abundance without constant replanting. This is its story. How a humble perennial tuber fed communities, survived sieges, fell out of favor when agriculture industrialized, and is now quietly being rediscovered by chefs, gardeners, and scientists searching for resilience. Long before European ships crossed the Atlantic, native peoples of the North American plains and woodlands cultivated and conserved this sunflower relative. According to several indigenous traditions, the tuber belonged to a larger web of food knowledge, planted in rotation with corn and beans, left in patches for wildlife and kin, and harvested with techniques honed over generations. These are cultural memories, not scientific claims. They are how communities recorded survival strategies in story and practice. Early European explorers noticed the plant and its usefulness. Journals attributed to travelers and chroniclers from the 17th and 18th centuries describe tubers being traded and sometimes carried back across the ocean, small living packets of food and resistance. Samuel de Champlain, in the peculiar archive of early New World observations, is often associated with reports that moved native crops into European awareness. Later, expedition journals, including those linked to the Corps of Discovery across the continent, mention earth-stored tubers that helped parties through lean months. These were not exotic rarities, but workhorses of subsistence, the kind of crop that did not require perfect conditions to offer something on the table. In cold soils where other root crops struggled, Helianthus tuberosus often produced reliably. In drought or thin soils, it soldiered on. To understand its stubborn charm, picture peeling back a clod of earth. The tubers are irregular, long knobs, short bulbs, clusters joined like fingers to a palm. They are not uniform like the potato varieties bred for machine harvest and conveyor belts. They vary in size, color, and density. In flavor, they are distinct, nutty, slightly sweet when roasted, crisp and watery when raw. Cooked, they brighten dishes with a caramelized edge.
Raw, thinly sliced, they add a crunchy, edible surprise to salads. These sensory qualities helped secure the tuber a place in household kitchens and communal caches. And because the plant is perennial, its root system survives winter and sprouts anew. Once established, it returns without the annual sowing that dominates modern rotations. There's practical evidence for its value. Historical accounts and agricultural trials over the years record impressive yields in certain contexts, especially in cooler climates where potato productivity lacked. Some reports claim harvests large enough to sustain villages through bad seasons. These figures come with important caveats. Yields vary by soil, climate, plant variety, and the method of harvest. Modern trials produce mixed results depending on the question asked. Still, the core point remains. In marginal conditions, the plant often outperformed expectations and provided a reliable carbohydrate source. Yet something changed. By the late 19th and 20th centuries, the logic of agriculture shifted toward uniformity, throughput, and storage. Industrial systems demanded crops that could be planted, harvested mechanically, sorted by size, and stored in large cold warehouses for months. The spade-friendly, irregular knobbles of Helianthus tuberosus did not fit that mold. They are difficult to harvest cleanly with mechanized diggers. Their shapes made sorting and packing inefficient, and their thin skins and high sugar content shortens shelf life under conventional storage. Market demand moved toward tubers and roots that behaved well in supply chains, not toward stubborn little bulbs that resisted being tamed. Alongside those technical reasons came cultural ones, some practical, some painful. The plant's carbohydrate is not starch in the sense of potatoes or cassava. Instead, it is rich in a prebiotic called inulin. Inulin is a soluble fiber that passes into the large intestine and becomes food for certain microbes. Many people benefit from increased inulin. It can promote beneficial bacteria, aid regularity, and act as a gentle bulking agent in the gut. But for some, especially when eaten in larger amounts, it can cause gas and bloating as microbes shift. In times of abundant choice, that digestive quirk was a minor curiosity. In times of scarcity, it could become a bitter symbol. Wartime scenes crystallized this complexity. During the Great Wars and the sieges that accompanied them, people turned to what grew near: roots, wild greens, and perennial tubers. In towns and cities under blockade or occupation, families dug up stored patches, boiled and mashed, roasted and stewed whatever the earth offered. Accounts from civilians in multiple countries describe how certain foods, once associated with survival, later became markers of humiliation. A crop that had saved lives in winter became in memory a reminder of hunger's worst nights. Cultural stigma can be durable.
After conflict, markets and kitchens leaned toward foods that symbolized prosperity and normality. Crops tied to deprivation were quietly shelved. That stigma is part of the plant's decline, but it is not the whole story. The rise of monoculture, chemical inputs, and a global logistics system valorized predictability. Crops that couldn't be lined up on conveyors, graded by machine, or shipped for months were put under pressure. The tuber's very virtues, its irregularity, its ability to regrow without annual planting, its capacity to persist in marginal soils, translated into behavior that modern supply chains labeled unruly. Where abundance is measured by how much a corporation can own and move, abundance that escapes ownership becomes awkward. Yet seeds of revival have long been present in kitchens and experimental plots. Beginning in the late 20th century, a handful of growers and produce buyers in California and elsewhere began to reintroduce the knobbly roots to high-end markets. Chefs, always on the lookout for texture and story, embraced the tuber's crunchy raw texture and caramelized roast notes. On a restaurant plate, it became an ingredient of surprise, a thing that tasted familiar yet slightly other. This culinary renaissance created demand beyond subsistence gardens. It demanded new names and new narratives that could remove stigma and transform memory into curiosity. Marketing in the 1980s and 1990s played a role. New labels, prettier packing, and stories that framed the tuber as artisanal rather than desperate. At the same time, a different revival took shape among growers who care less about fine dining and more about resilience. Permaculture practitioners and regenerative farmers began to reevaluate perennial and self-propagating crops as tools for soil building and food security. Helianthus tuberosus fits several permaculture desiderata. It provides biomass for the soil, it spreads slowly when managed, and it yields a carbohydrate without the annual fossil fuel cost of seed, planting, and intensive tillage. Trials on marginal lands, slopes, thin soils, saline edges have shown potential where annual staples struggle. For community gardens and homesteads, the idea of planting a patch and returning each year with fresh harvests is compelling. Scientific interest has followed these practical and culinary revivals. Nutrition researchers have studied inulin's effects on gut microbiota, noting that shifts in microbial populations can have systemic effects on digestion, on mineral absorption, and possibly on markers of metabolic health. But the science is careful. Studies suggest potential benefits when inulin is consumed in moderate, incremental amounts. Some people experience discomfort at first. Dietary adaptation and portion control are common recommendations. Agricultural scientists have explored varieties and breeding techniques aimed at producing tubers that are easier to harvest, store better, and yield more consistently. Trials aimed at marginal crop portfolios, plants for landscapes where climate stress or economic isolation make conventional staples risky, often include Helianthus tuberosus as a candidate. There is ethical complexity in this rediscovery. Much of the early history of the crop is entangled with indigenous stewardship and knowledge systems. When modern markets or researchers discover a plant, there is a risk of erasing or minimizing those earlier relationships. The right way to tell this story is to acknowledge that many indigenous communities managed and held knowledge about perennial root crops long before outside attention arrived. Those traditions are cultural treasures, and any revival should be attentive to sovereignty and to fair recognition of knowledge holders. Another complexity is ecology. Perennial, persistent species can escape managed plots. In some regions, the tuber is labeled invasive when it spreads into natural habitats and competes with native flora. The characterization depends on landscape context. A plant that is a benign, useful steward in a home garden can be a problem in a fragile prairie remnant. Responsible advice, therefore, must be conservative. Encourage home and controlled plot cultivation, monitor spread, and avoid intentional planting in wild or protected areas. For the gardener or curious cook who hears the phrase "plant once, harvest forever" and wants to try, a few practical guidelines keep the promise honest and manageable. Start small. Plant a contained patch or use root barriers if you're concerned about spread. Harvest thoughtfully, leave enough in place to regrow, and rotate patches if you're aiming at both yield and soil health. When introducing the tuber to a table, begin with modest portions until palates and guts adapt. Roast it to concentrate sweetness, slice it raw into salads for crunch, or mash with other roots to balance texture. Avoid turning it into a monocrop. As with any resilient plant, diversity is a safeguard. The story of this plant is more than botany and cookery. It is a lesson about what modern food systems prize and what they discard. Systems built around scale and control favor crops that are easy to own, move, and standardize.
Those systems struggle to account for abundance that multiplies itself in the ground. The perennial tuber's very tendency to reappear without human intervention exposes a tension. Resilience often looks messy to the machinery of markets. That messiness, however, is precisely why communities that relied on the plant once could weather lean years. Wartime testimony helps make this point visceral. Picture a wintered city, coal scarcities, ration lines, and the quiet desperation in kitchens where every scrap is converted into broth. In such moments, the tuber was not a delicacy, but an insurance policy.
Families who had caged a patch of earth, who had kept a clump of perennial roots behind fences or in community gardens, found a food source when imports failed and supply chains snapped. After the crisis, the memory of eating the tuber, of stomachs aching, of shared humiliation, made it harder for markets to reassign the crop to categories of comfort. This memory shows how social narratives and market choices interact. A survival food can become, in times of normality, an unwanted reminder that people prefer to forget. And yet, memory shifts. Chefs transform stigma into curiosity. Gardeners reframe persistence as an asset. Scientists re-examine old varieties with new tools. When chefs plate the tuber with intention, balancing texture, pairing flavors, and telling the plant's story, they invite diners to reconnect to a taste that is both ancient and immediate. When farmers include perennial tubers in diverse polycultures, they build systems that are less dependent on fossil fuels and less brittle in the face of weather swings. When researchers test varieties on saline soils or under drought stress, they ask whether an old plant can help answer new problems. We must keep a clear-eyed attitude through this revival. The tuber is not a miracle bullet for food insecurity. It has trade-offs: harvesting labor, storage challenges, potential digestive adjustments, and ecological considerations in certain landscapes. But it does offer something increasingly rare in a world of engineered supply chains, a form of abundance that is local, perennial, and somewhat out of step with ownership-driven logic. That in itself is a political and practical possibility. So what does plant once, harvest forever mean in honest terms? It means that within a garden-scale context, a patch of this perennial can be allowed to regenerate and produce for multiple seasons without the yearly cost of buying seed or setting rows. It means less fossil fuel input for annual planting, and potentially more resilience in places where annual crops fail. It also means attention to soil, to neighbors, to the ways food memories shape taste and market access. The forever in Harvest Forever is not literal invincibility. It is a promise of repeatability under attentive stewardship. As you imagine your own backyard or community plot, picture integrating a controlled patch of these tubers into a rotation, near beans that fix nitrogen, under the shelter of taller perennials that protect soil, in a bed that receives regular attention. Picture a winter pantry where a few jars of roasted slices are ready to add to stews, and a summer salad brightened by thinly shaved crunchy rounds. Picture seedlings of community knowledge, workshops, seed exchanges, and recipes shared at potlucks, passing not just genetics but a culture of care. This is also a story about remembering. The crops we cultivate say as much about us as the crops we discard.
Recovering the tuber's story means honoring the people who stewarded it, recognizing the ways markets and memories shattered its place, and asking whether some forms of abundance deserve a second look. The plant asks little of us beyond a place to grow and a habit of respectful management. In return, it offers a different kind of security, a food that is reliably there when unpredictability arrives. If this story matters to you, subscribe and join a small but growing conversation about forgotten foods, resilient gardens, and the choices that shape what grows on our tables. In the end, the promise of plant once, harvest forever is an invitation, not to romanticize the past, not to expect easy fixes, but to experiment with abundance that does not fit neatly into modern boxes. It is both an agricultural technique and a metaphor. Abundance that resists commodification can make communities less fragile. It asks for patience, for respectful attention to indigenous histories and local ecologies, and for the humility to accept trade-offs. So plant a small patch, share a recipe, support growers who steward diversity rather than erase it. Learn the taste and the silence that comes with living memory. If you want practical resources, variety guides, safe cultivation notes, and recipes from chefs and home cooks working with this tuber responsibly, check the links below and keep exploring. Share this story with someone who cares about food history or resilience. Plant once, harvest for years. Remember who taught the soil how to feed us.